Okay everybody, welcome back to my channel. As you can probably tell, this is a voiceover and I'm not sure what it's going to be the voiceover for. So I'll probably insert a little thing here describing what you're about to see. I just find that that's helpful whenever I'm watching something with a voiceover. So that's what I'm going to do with that for you. So, just telling you what's going to go on in the video part of this video is, I am painting the picture of a beautiful lady with horns. Now, just to let you know this, in about the middle of the video, my thing stopped recording, but I didn't realize it. So, there's a big chunk of me painting the hair that is missing. So, I will hope that you will bear with me in that. And now let's get back to the video. And okay, so let's get started with today's video, which is I'm going to be doing a kind of a book review because I find it helpful after I've read a book to just tell somebody about it, because it like refinalizes the stuff that I learned about it in my brain and then I remember it better. So the book that I want to talk to you guys about today is called The Robber Barons by Matthew Josephson. And this book is about the different dudes that lived in the era of railroad building. So these were the guys like Andrew Carnegie, J.P. Morgan, and the people that worked in the railroads, the steel works, the iron works, and the banking, and then people who had a lot of money with their companies in the stock markets. And those are the main characters of this book. And a really interesting part about the book is when it was published. The original copy of this book was published in 1934. The guy who wrote this book knew people who had actually talked to the people he was writing about. So I just find that super interesting. And right here, and then the page right next to where it has the publishing date, there's the beginning of the foreword, and it says, "The Robber Barons was written during the Great Slump, which, beginning in 1929, reached its lowest steps in 1929 through 1933. The new era of prosperity had ended, the captains and kings of industry were some of them departing, and we were asking ourselves insistently how we as a nation had got into such a pass." So it's just super interesting, and I really enjoyed reading this book. When I first started, it took me a couple months actually to read this book because of school and other stuff going on. When I started reading it, it was a little bit tedious, but after reading it for a while, it became one of the books that I read for pleasure. And basically, the chapter list actually has descriptions of the chapters. So I'm just going to read those to you, and then I'm going to talk to you guys about what stood out to me. So the first, there's part 1, part 2, there's 2 parts to it, and then within each part there's chapters. So the first chapter in part 1 is called The National Scene, the National Character. And so it talks about the Civil War, flowering of our Industrial Revolution, the early republic as an agrarian mercantile democracy, which is really interesting because I don't really know that much about original America, and like original I know, but like into the industrial age was some new stuff for me. And so getting a little bit in depth about how not content but product went from the stages of making it to selling it from an economical perspective was very interesting to learn about. Calvinism and the pecuniary spirit, which is talking about like the idea that you have to make yourself. It says later the self-made man, and that's kind of basically the same thing. The religious backing and inclination behind people wanting to work for themselves. Benjamin Franklin, Legend of the Self-Made Man, Slater, Astor, Vanderbilt, Drew. Those are the last names of some of the characters they introduced in the beginning, kind of the originals, the old guys. Later in the book, they become the senior, and then their children are the juniors, and those are like J.P. Morgan is a junior to Pierpont Morgan. Well, he's not a junior, but he's the son of, or the brother of, I don't remember. The Yankee Trader at the Frontier, Perpetual Land Boom, California, A Parable, and the New Barons Confront the Democracy. So the first chapter is kind of an overview of what the rest of the book will be, and also a little backdrop for you to base your ideas on. Chapter 2 is called What the Young Men Dream, Childhood and Youth of Captains of Industry, The Race for Fortune, Environment of Poverty and Optimism, The Training for Ruse, Beginnings of J. Cook, J. Gould, Andrew Carnegie, Pierpont Morgan, John D. Rockefeller, and others. So this chapter gives you a little baseline for what life was like for a kid and how these people grew up. Most of the people that you hear about in this book had really poor beginnings, actually, and they had to work their way up to being in the upper class. All the like clout and power that they had, they got from the money which they worked themselves to earn. So even though their methods of getting the money wasn't necessarily the most honest, because their desire was to get money, not necessarily to also have quality products, they still did a lot of work for themselves to actually make that money. Chapter 3 is called Of Empire Builders. The young entrepreneurs stay behind the lines. The new order and the new business chances, partition of the public domain. So the first three sections of this chapter are talking about how the Civil War happened, and a lot of the people who are in this book ended up not fighting in the war, being able to escape the draft, or I don't think there was a draft then, I'm not really sure. They were able to not have to fight, and so they worked on their businesses instead, and they actually they were able to make more money during the Civil War because they had kind of the beginning of a monopoly on certain industries, because they were still making stuff when a lot of other people weren't. And they were also able to see influence from other carpetbaggers, which is a term from Gone with the Wind. It's not, but that's where I learned it, about that sort of thing. Then it says, J. Cook as the government's banker, his new financial technique, the war profiteers, Morgan's speculations in carbines, Jay Gould's dealings in gold, rise of the Erie ring, Vanderbilt's rotten ships, his entrance into railroads, the Harlem corner, Vanderbilt's conflicts with Erie. And so that's just talking about like basically what these people did, how they started out in getting the beginnings of their fortune and the beginnings of what they were dealing with. And the Erie ring, which is a ring of people who own different parts of the Erie Railroad section, is a very important player. It comes back later, and Vanderbilt definitely had a lot of conflicts with them, not only in this chapter. To give you an idea of how long this book is, I believe it's not like all of the part that you would read, because I don't read the extra bits at the ends of books usually. It's about 453 pages before the bibliography, which for some people that's a lot. It's not for me, but like I said, it also took me a couple months to read. So chapter 4, The Winning of the West. Manifest Destiny in the Great West, Coming of the Iron Horse, wartime railroad grants, a national plan for railways to the Pacific, Festival of the Golden Spike, the Western Land and Town Booms, J. Cook's Banana Belt, Cook's Northern Pacific Project. So at this point, people were, we'd bought more territories. Well, I mean, at the Civil War, we had most of the states by the Civil War, but I think we had 48. I'm not sure. My, general history knowledge isn't that great. I just know, random snippets and facts. So, please don't judge me on that. But everybody was going west, and these entrepreneurs knew that they were going to go west, so they would buy up chunks of land, or they would buy the rights to build a railroad through a certain area of land, and then they would build the railroad, and then they would go to different countries and advertise for a bunch of people to come and live in the area where the railroad was, so that they would be able to make money from the railroad running, because if nobody lived there, then there would be no point for there to be a railroad there, because the railroads were there to pick up merchandise from farmers and then take them into other areas and then trade them, or take up merchandise from factories and take them to other factories and then take them to people that needed to buy them and stuff like that. So at the beginning, a lot of the people that were building railroads didn't know anything about railroads, and so it was really interesting to read about that, because all they cared about was the money. They saw that one person had gotten a lot of money from building a railroad, and they were like, me too, I want in on this. And then it ended up not working out so well for them, because they made it super cheaply. They saved a lot of money in the building of it, but in the end, they basically had to completely rebuild it, because you could only use the rails a couple times before they started to break, because of how badly they were made. And the Festival of the Golden Spike is the combining of the first transcontinental railroad, I think. The one that went from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. I think that's that one where they met in the middle. Chapter 5 is called Two Captains of Industry. The new tempo of business enterprise, Carnegie becomes an iron master, skill in promotion and using others, his large venture in Bessemer steel. Rockefeller enters the oil trade, disorder in the oil market, expansion of Rockefeller's company, founding of Standard Oil, use of freight rebates, birth of the great monopoly, the Southern Improvement Company. A lot of what was going on right now were people were realizing that they all wanted to make money from this thing, which was railroads, and they didn't want to fight each other, so they just started making companies. Later on, they totally wanted to fight each other, and they just fought each other. But at this point, they were okay with being slightly less competitive, so that's what they did. And people who wanted to kind of have a little bit of, they wanted to have the railroad and the stuff that was going to go on the railroad. They owned the company for making, I think this comes a little bit later, actually, but people who owned, Carnegie owned this iron-making business, and then, so he was able to make railroads, and so then he owned railroads to ship the iron to make the railroads, which ended up making it, more cost-effective for him, I think. And then, in chapter, they're in Roman numerals 6, the fight for Erie. Vanderbilt's contest with Erie for key positions, his buying of Erie stock, treachery of Drew, Gold, and Fisk, Vanderbilt prosecutes, flight of the Erie ring to New Jersey, the Boodle War in Albany, triumph of Gold and Fisk, the Albany and Susquehanna incident, Morgan wins his spurs, Jay Gould's gold conspiracy, Black Friday 1869. So, like I said, now people are actually ready and willing to fight, and the Erie Ring did a lot of illegal stuff and got away with it, and the people who worked for them and the people who were like in their subject domain area were not chill with that, because the people who owned the railroads were able to say, oh well, you want to ship something on this, you have to pay this much, and they could tell your neighbor that they only had to pay like half of that, and they were perfectly allowed to do that. No one was really stopping them because there weren't standard rates for everybody. So if they didn't like a company, they would just be like, okay, well, you're gonna have to pay 3 times what you were paying now. Great, cool. And to make more money for themselves, instead of just shipping it directly like the fastest way possible, they would make something take the longest way possible, or make it use the whole route. So if you needed something shipped and it was like 2 miles to your left, but the railway didn't want to go those 2 miles in that direction, they would go in a big circle and end up going all the way around and just coming back to you from your right. This is a very like generalized example. That's not exactly what happened, but I don't really know what railroads look like, so they describe them as a spider or an octopus. So I hope that makes more sense. But yeah, so that they wow, lost my train of thought. The people were not happy because their prices for things changed so fast, and the prices in the stock market were related to the prices in the railroad, and that was just very intense for people because, you know, that's a lot to deal with. And then chapter 7, Grandeurs and Miseries of the Empire Building. The Golden Age of Speculation, which is, it's both digging for gold, but it's also, just finding new enterprises, basically. The Speculator was another word for carpetbagger. They don't mean exactly the same thing, but it's a similar vibe if you know what carpetbagger means. The alliance of undertakers with politicians. Rumblings of scandal, the Erie Revolution. Assassination of Jim Fisk, who was the guy who was working in the Erie Company. They killed him because they didn't like him. Ejection of gold, because I think either he was making too much money or he was a traitor. I don't remember. Read the book though. Like, this is a great book. Uprisings against Rockefeller in the oil regions. The credit mobiler exposures. The vulnerability of Jay Cooke. The Northern Pacific bubble. Failure of Jay Cooke and Company. Panic of 1873. Like, I kind of forgot what Panic of 1873 is, but I'm pretty sure it had something to do with the stock market, because these dudes were not chill in any way and totally fought with each other, like, all the time. Alright, and now we're into part 2. So part 1 goes, part 2 starts on page 177, and then there's 450 pages in the book, so part 2 is definitely longer than part 1, and I also found it way more interesting, too. When I actually got to part 2, I was, like, way more into it, because the first couple chapters of part 1 are kind of like a backdrop, and it's, like, 50 pages of backdrop, so if that's a little hard for you to get through, then yeah, it starts as a little bit of a slow read if you're not a very fast reader. So chapter 8 is called Rising from the Ruins. Gains of the strongest undertakers during panic, reign of unbridled competition, concentrated struggle for railway lines. Yeah, people were just pretty much fighting within companies. Some people were actually fighting with weapons, but that was mostly the workers in the companies. the actual owners of the companies were fighting with money and with manipulating the stock market so that the people who weren't in the know lost a lot of money. And that's really interesting to me. I've read a few books about the stock market, and it just seems like it would be super hard to actually win. But these dudes were able to do it, but I think that's mainly because they knew it was going to happen because they were controlling the stock. It's not like they were predicting it. So that's a little bit harder to do. Advance of the Vanderbilt dynasty, death of the Commodore, who was the oldest Vanderbilt, and see, he built a super big house, and then he ended up dying in it because he wanted it to be finished before he was gonna die. And then after that, a couple people were scared to build houses because they were like, well, if you build a house, you're just gonna die in it. So I found that to be interesting. It doesn't say that in that chapter, it says it later on. New York Central under Billy Vanderbilt, because that was his kid. And then the public be damned, blackmail of railroad barons. So people were tired of the railroad blackmailing them, so they were like, well, we know your dirty little secrets, so you have to do stuff for us or we won't do stuff for you, and all of that. At this point, this is about 20 minutes, a little bit over, and I don't like to make videos much longer than that, so I'm going to make a part 2 for this book review / summary. I really like this book, and I highly recommend that you read it, and I don't know if it'll be offered in a lot of libraries because of how old it is, but we offer classics that were written in, like, 1000 AD and stuff, because like the Odyssey and the Iliad are pretty old, so hopefully you guys will be able to find this book because it's very interesting and it gives you a whole new idea about what the game of Monopoly is like.